This is History Alive with Kaila and Vanessa. Today's episode is called Felons, Florida, and Freedom.
Hi everyone, I'm Vanessa. I'm a sophomore at Hobart and William Smith Colleges.
And I'm Kaila, also a sophomore at Hobart and William Smith Colleges. We're both so excited you're joining in and listening to our podcast today. Our focus for today is about what is going on with Florida's disenfranchisement laws.
Right, so Florida's been in the spotlight recently with the midterm elections and how close they were, but also with the passing of Amendment 4, which is known as the Voting Restoration Amendment. The passing of this amendment restores the right to vote for people with prior felony convictions, except for those convicted of murder or a sexual offense. People with felony convictions now have the right to vote after their sentence is completed.
It's important that we look closer at the disenfranchisement law to specifically see what people it affects the most.
Good idea, Kaila. The question we're posing to our listeners today is, how did structural racism shape the disenfranchisement law in Florida? Before we can get into it, we have to look at what the disenfranchisement laws in Florida were like prior to Amendment 4 passing. A lot of people were wondering where Florida's disenfranchisement laws even came from.
It's hard to imagine, but they're actually rooted from slavery. It basically goes back to the Reconstruction Amendments of 1865 to 1877 and Jim Crow laws. As we know, the 13th Amendment emancipated slaves, the 14th Amendment granted equal citizenship to freed slaves, and the 15th Amendment prohibited denial of the right to vote based on, and I quote, the race, color, or previous condition of servitude.
Right, except in Florida in 1865, they actually limited the right to vote to white males and restricted free African Americans of things, known as the Black Codes. Discriminatory state attempts persisted through the Jim Crow era and the Civil Rights era.
Out of this came Florida's disenfranchisement law. It was made after Jim Crow as an attempt to keep segregation in the South. This law was created on the basis of racial discrimination through Reconstruction and Jim Crow periods, and it persisted until 2018. Florida's felony disenfranchisement law in 2016 was the same that it was when it was inserted into the Florida Constitution over 150 years ago.
Ultimately, this posed detrimental long-term effects to many citizens that were residents of Florida.
Right. Up until 2018 midterm elections, a felon could only regain the right to vote if the state board restored the individual's right after 5 to 7 years of sentence completion. However, even this was rare. In 2016, only a few hundred out of tens of thousands of applications got accepted. This is giving an elected official the right to choose who gets to vote.
This contributed to Florida being the most disenfranchised state in America, though Illinois, Kentucky, and Virginia also have laws where convicted felons do not have the right to vote. Citizens face the most disenfranchisement in Florida.
The statistics are actually pretty crazy. As of 2016 in Florida, almost 2 million people of the voting population were disenfranchised due to a felony conviction. In 2016, Florida held the highest rate of felons that were disenfranchised in the United States.
That's such a high number. All of these individuals, had they been able to vote, would have drastically changed the outcome of the elections. In the 2000 election, 537 votes decided the presidential election.
The election in 2000 was between Republican George W. Bush, who won the presidency, and Democrat Al Gore. Without the disenfranchisement law, results from Florida could have been dramatically different since so many Florida state residents lost this right. This law has significant impact on citizens' ability to participate in democracy, and this is especially important being a Florida state resident because it is an important swing state.
The constitutional rights of so many citizens are taken away by this disenfranchisement law. People who complete their sentences are still usually locked out of the system for life. It's important to look at how and why it's still in place and functioning in the year of 2018. Rick Scott, who's the governor of Florida, in 2011 issued some of the most restrictive clemency rules in several administrations.
Yes, the current Florida governor, who is Rick Scott, was very adamant about this law persisting, despite that there had been attempts to refute it. For example, in 2000, Gainesville, Florida resident Thomas Johnson filed a class action lawsuit that the felony disenfranchisement law violates the U.S. Constitution. However, the U.S. courts for the Southern District of Florida said the law was not purposely discriminatory. It was appealed on multiple occasions, and the Supreme Court declined to hear the case.
By December of 2015, nearly 5 years after taking office, Governor Scott's administration had restored voting rights to fewer than 2,000 Floridians statewide, while over 20,000 applications remained pending. The process was tedious and ineffective, purposefully so. After probation, there's a 5 to 7 year waiting period, followed about a 9-year backlog, and then if you even get that far, you have to go all the way to Tallahassee just to have your hearing at the clemency board. That board's made up of Governor Rick Scott and 3 other Republicans.
Wow, Vanessa, that's crazy. So many citizens were affected by something that was implemented over 150 years ago. In fact, Florida disenfranchised more of its citizens than Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Tennessee combined. In our next segment, we will discuss how a law rooted from racism, but disguised as an overall felon disenfranchisement, has disproportionately affected African American men up until 2018.
Thanks for joining us again for the second segment of History Alive with Vanessa and Kaila, Felons, Florida, and Freedom. Now that we've gone over some of the basics about the disenfranchisement law in Florida, we're going to talk about how it affected African American men at a significantly higher rate and how this was even possible.
It all goes back to the oppressive structure of our legal and justice systems. As we talked about in the first segment, this law was passed during Jim Crow, meaning it was going to be very racist. It might even go deeper than just the Jim Crow laws. It roots to slavery as well. Over 200 years ago, Frederick Douglass talked about the criminalization of African Americans as he says in his speech, The Meaning of July 4th for the Negro. He says, there are 72 crimes in the state of Virginia, which, if committed by a black man, no matter how ignorant he be, subject him to the punishment of death, while only 2 of the same crimes will subject a white man to the like punishment. Slaves were not allowed to learn how to read or write. There is no way for a slave to read a book of laws, and it is highly unlikely that they would be provided with one. Even if a black man did not know the law, if he breaks it, he can be killed. White men are held to a totally different standard. 72 crimes is an excessive amount to be punishable by death. In this way, the state is able to further control the lives of black men.
Douglass also describes this criminalization of black men again when he explains the discriminatory nature of the fugitive slave law. He says the fugitive slave law makes mercy to them a crime and bribes the judge who tries them. An American judge gets $10 for every victim he consigns to slavery and 5 when he fails to do so. The oath of any 2 villains is sufficient under this hell-black enactment to send the most pious and exemplary black men into the remorseless jaws of slavery. Due to the criminalization of black men, regardless of their innocence, they are much more likely to get convicted and be in prison today. It's still true over 200 years later from when Douglass gave his speech, with such a disproportionately high number of black men being convicted of felonies that takes away their rights to vote, removes them from the system, and takes their voice away.
Right. On this, well-known activist Angela Davis presents the idea of the prison industrial complex in her speech, The Meaning of Freedom. She says about 13 million people go in and out of prisons in the U.S. over a year, and the majority of these people are people of color. It reflects our oppressive society and restrictive nature.
Angela Davis also points to the fact that the system is rooted in slavery. As she says, it is a criminalization process anchored in slavery. It's important to look at the historical context of the disenfranchisement law in Florida in order to expose this underlying racist structure. Otherwise, it might just seem like a punishment for all people convicted of a felony, when actually it's directly targeting a specific group of people. The numbers are unbelievable. While 1 out of every 10 Floridians is disenfranchised, nearly 1 of every 4 black Floridians is disenfranchised.
The law forever punishes people who are once convicted, which permanently removes their voice from the voting system. Angela Davis explains that no matter how long someone's sentence is, that once incarcerated person receives collateral consequences for life that leads to social issues and being deprived of so much that the Constitution should promise them.
The criminalization of African Americans, especially African American men, that Frederick Douglass and Angela Davis are talking about, has resulted in discrimination due to Florida's previous disenfranchisement law.
Right, the statistics are crazy. 1 in 5 African American adults could not vote in Florida. 1/3 of the people who have lost the right to vote in Florida are black, even though people of color only make up 16% of Florida's voting population. This law disenfranchises 21% of Florida's African American voting population. African Americans that were subjected to harsh disenfranchisement laws resulted in a decrease of turnout levels for them, regardless if they have even been incarcerated or not.
Yeah, of course there's going to decrease the turnout levels for them because they feel like they're not wanted in the system. Of course, the numbers and percentages for this law are useful, but it's so important to remember that these people are more than numbers. So join us next time as we take an inside look into the personal life of someone affected by Florida's disenfranchisement law.
Thanks again for joining us on our third and final segment of History Alive with Vanessa and Kaila, Felons, Florida, and Freedom. We have discussed the history of Florida's disenfranchisement law, how it was rooted in structural racism, and how it continued to discriminate against African Americans until Amendment 4 was passed after the 2018 midterm elections in November. Now we are going to discuss how the passing of this amendment has directly affected residents of Florida.
Roger Kemp shared his powerful story with the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, and we think it's something you all need to hear.
Roger Kemp is an African American man who is active in politics and passionate about fighting for civil rights for everyone. He even worked on the Obama campaign as he raised a ton of money. He ran a field for office for the Charlie Field campaign.
Being so involved in politics, it was absolutely shocking to him when he received the letter in the mail once Rick Scott had been reelected, saying that his voting rights had been revoked. It was the first time in his life that he would not be able to vote in an election.
At first, he thought it must be a mistake, but then realized something from 32 years ago was being brought back up to haunt him. Roderick was convicted with a felony charge of possession of cocaine in 1986. He served a few months in a county jail, 32 years prior. He had been actively voting for the past 32 years, and then, with Rick Scott's extremely restrictive policies, everything was taken away from Roderick.
Roger Kemp is not alone in his experience. Hundreds of thousands of people received letters like this and had their rights pulled out from under them immediately. Roger clearly moved on from his past of recreational drug use, but then the disenfranchisement law still punished him. He feels as though he has served his time and he's been an active citizen. Rick Scott is perfectly fine to collect taxes from disenfranchised voters and probably would even punish them if they refuse to pay, but he refuses to let them exercise their civil right of voting.
Many people like Roger Kemp felt extreme relief on November 6, 2018. He and other Florida state residents finally have restored their civic rights of being able to participate in democracy by voting. Florida's disenfranchisement law, implemented over 150 years ago, had gone against the First and 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. This somehow prevailed until 2018.
This law was created on the basis of discrimination rooting from retaliation by Florida during anti-slavery, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow periods. Unfortunately, this attempt was successful for far too long for a period of time. African Americans, especially African American men, are disproportionately incarcerated in America.
Once you are in the prison system, there are, according to Angela Davis, collateral consequences that affect someone for life. Being said, African American residents of Florida disproportionately lost their civic right and duty to be able to participate in the system of democracy by voting.
This allowed the law to persist and continue discriminating against African Americans. If the disenfranchisement law in Florida had been amended years ago when it should have been, the results of elections would have been dramatically different.
Now, with Amendment 4 intact, we and the rest of America can see how it will further affect Florida and our country's future. Thank you for tuning in to the episode of Felons, Florida, and Freedom on the podcast History Alive with Kaila and Vanessa. Please tune in next week for our episode about the Obamacare court ruling and the healthcare system in the United States.